Eleanor Hartley stood in the shadows of the elegant drawing-room, her worn gloves clutched in trembling hands as she faced the woman who held her future in perfectly manicured fingers. The Duchess of Ashford sat upon a velvet chair like a queen upon her throne, her beauty so exquisite it seemed almost unnatural. Diamonds glittered at her throat, and her gown of sapphire silk made Eleanor painfully aware of her own faded muslin dress with its carefully mended seams. "You understand what I am asking of you?" the Duchess said, her voice smooth as honey laced with poison. Eleanor swallowed hard. She understood perfectly. The proposal was outrageous, scandalous, impossible. Yet here she stood, 28 years old, with no prospects and a younger sister who needed medicine they could not afford. Their father had died 6 months ago, leaving nothing but debts. The small cottage they rented would be forfeit by month's end if Eleanor could not find the money. "I understand, Your Grace," Eleanor whispered. The Duchess smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "My husband has grown distant, cold. He spends his days in his study or riding across the estate as though the devil himself chases him. He barely looks at me anymore." She stood and walked to the window, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I need to know if his heart can still be moved, if he is capable of desire. And you wish me to—" Eleanor could not finish the sentence. "Tempt him, seduce him if you will. Let us see if the great Duke of Ashford is still a man beneath all that grief and ice." The Duchess turned, her eyes sharp as glass. "If he falls for your charms, I will know the truth of his heart. If he rejects you, well," she shrugged one elegant shoulder, "at least I will know where I stand." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was no beauty. Her hair was an unremarkable brown, her figure too thin from months of stretching every meal. Her face was pleasant enough, she supposed, but nothing that would turn heads. Beside the Duchess, she was a sparrow next to a swan. "Why me?" Eleanor asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. The Duchess laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking crystal. "Because you are nothing. No one. A governess without a position. A spinster without hope. If he falls for you, it will prove he is desperate for any woman's attention. It will give me the power I need." She moved closer, and Eleanor caught the scent of expensive perfume. "I will pay you £200, enough to save your sister, enough to begin again somewhere far from here." £200. The sum made Eleanor's head spin. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. With that, Margaret could see the finest doctors in London. They could keep the cottage. They could eat more than porridge and bread. "What if he does not? What if the Duke is not interested?" Eleanor asked. "Then you will have tried, and I will still pay you £50 for your effort." The Duchess returned to her chair. "But I suspect my husband is weak enough now to fall for any trap. His first wife died 3 years ago. He has been a ghost ever since. It is time to see if that ghost can be awakened." Eleanor thought of Margaret, pale and coughing in their cold cottage. She thought of the rent collector's hard eyes. She thought of the marriage proposals she had never received, the dances at which she had stood against the wall, the whispers that she was on the shelf, too old, too plain, too poor. "I will do it," she said, her voice barely audible. The Duchess's smile widened. "Excellent. You will begin tomorrow. I have arranged for you to be hired as the new librarian at Ashford Hall. My husband spends hours in that library. It will be your hunting ground." She pulled a small purse from her desk and handed it to Eleanor. £20 now, the rest when the task is complete." Eleanor took the purse, feeling its weight like a stone of shame in her palm. "How will I know if I have succeeded?" "Oh, you will know," the Duchess said softly. "And so will I. I have eyes everywhere in Ashford Hall. Every word, every glance, every moment will be reported to me. Try your best, Miss Hartley. Seduce my husband. Make him want you. Let us see what becomes of it." Eleanor left the grand house in a daze, the purse hidden in her pocket. The autumn air was cold against her burning cheeks. What had she agreed to? What kind of woman had she become? Yet as she walked the 3 miles back to the cottage, she thought of Margaret's laboured breathing and hardened her heart. She would do what needed to be done. She would play her part. She would earn that money and save her sister. She did not know that the Duchess had no intention of letting her succeed. She did not know that this was all a carefully laid trap, not for the Duke, but for Eleanor herself. The Duchess wanted proof of her husband's fidelity. She wanted to expose any woman foolish enough to try to seduce him. She wanted to humiliate and destroy anyone who dared reach above their station. Eleanor knew none of this as she entered the cottage, and counted out £10 to give to Margaret for the doctor. She knew only that tomorrow she would enter Ashford Hall and meet the Duke. She would try to catch the eye of a man so far above her station that the very idea was laughable. She would pretend to be something she was not. She spent that night, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the Duke of Ashford would be like. The next morning, Eleanor stood before the massive doors of Ashford Hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The estate was larger than she had imagined, with its grey stone walls and countless windows that caught the morning light. The gardens stretched in every direction, perfectly manicured despite the autumn season. Everything spoke of wealth, power, and a world to which she did not belong. A stern housekeeper named Mrs. Bramble led her through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead Ashfords, their painted eyes seeming to judge her with every step. The library, when they finally reached it, took Eleanor's breath away. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, thousands of them, their leather spines gleaming. The room smelled of paper and dust and something else, something masculine and warm. "His Grace takes his morning coffee here at 10 o'clock, Mrs. Bramble said, her voice clipped. "You are to have the books organized by subject and author. You are not to speak unless spoken to. You are not to bother His Grace with unnecessary questions. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor said. Mrs. Bramble left her alone in the vast room. Eleanor removed her cloak and bonnet, smoothing down her dress. It was her best one, a soft grey with tiny pearl buttons, but it was still shabby compared to the splendor around her. She began examining the shelves, trying to understand the current system of organization. Many books seemed to be out of place, as though someone had pulled them down and never returned them properly. She was on her toes, reaching for a volume on the highest shelf, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Who are you?" The voice was deep, cold, and entirely unexpected. Eleanor jumped, lost her balance, and began to fall backward. Strong hands caught her around the waist, steadying her. She found herself looking up into the most devastating face she had ever seen. The Duke of Ashford was tall, with broad shoulders beneath his dark coat. His hair was black as midnight with threads of silver at the temples. His eyes were grey, the colour of storm clouds, and they held such pain in their depths that Eleanor forgot to breathe. His jaw was strong, his features aristocratic and perfectly formed. He was beautiful in the way ancient statues were beautiful, cold and untouchable and impossibly perfect. He set her on her feet and stepped back immediately, as though the contact had burned him. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Eleanor Hartley, Your Grace," she managed, dropping into a curtsy that nearly sent her tumbling again. "The new librarian." His eyes swept over her, a quick assessment that made her feel even more inadequate. "I was not informed we required a new librarian." "Her Grace arranged it," Eleanor said. which was not quite a lie. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. Did she? It was not a question. He moved past her to his desk, where coffee had already been set out. He poured himself a cup with precise movements, never spilling a drop. You will work quietly. You will not disturb me. You will leave when I dismiss you. Yes, Your Grace. He sat behind the desk and opened a ledger, effectively dismissing her from his awareness. Eleanor turned back to the shelves, her heart still racing. She had expected someone cold, yes, but not someone so utterly closed off. There was a wall around the Duke that seemed impenetrable. How was she supposed to seduce a man who looked at her as though she were merely another piece of furniture? The morning passed in silence. Eleanor worked methodically, taking down books and noting their placement in a small journal she had brought. Occasionally she glanced at the Duke, studying him when she thought he was too absorbed in his work to notice. He never looked up, never acknowledged her presence. His hand moved across papers, writing in a firm, clear script. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world with no one to help him bear it. At noon, a footman arrived with lunch on a tray. The Duke ate mechanically, without pleasure or interest. Eleanor's stomach growled softly, reminding her that she had eaten nothing but a piece of bread that morning. The Duke's eyes flicked up at the sound. "Have you eaten?" he asked. The question surprised her so much that she forgot to answer for a moment. "I know, Your Grace." He gestured to the footman, who had not yet left. "Bring another tray." "That is not necessary," Eleanor protested. "I am only a servant. You are working in my home, and you will be fed properly." His tone left no room for argument. The footman bowed and departed. The Duke returned to his meal as though the exchange had never happened. When her own tray arrived, Eleanor sat in a small chair near the window, as far from the Duke as possible. The food was simple but more abundant than anything she had at home. Cold chicken, cheese, bread, with butter, an apple. She ate slowly, trying not to appear too hungry, though she wanted to devour every bite. "You are very thin." She looked up to find the Duke watching her, his expression unreadable. "I have been between positions, Your Grace," she said carefully. "For how long?" 6 months. Something softened in his eyes, just for an instant. "Eat what you wish. Take the rest home, if you need it." The kindness in his words, so unexpected from such a cold exterior, made Eleanor's throat tighten. "Thank you, Your Grace." He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. "My late wife enjoyed the library. She would have been pleased to know it was being properly organized." His voice was low, almost as though he was speaking to himself. "She loved books more than anything, more than me, perhaps." Eleanor did not know what to say. The grief in his words was palpable, a living thing that filled the room. "She died in winter," he continued. 3 years ago this December. Influenza. She was gone within a week. I could do nothing but watch her slip away. "I am sorry for your loss, Your Grace." He turned to face her, and the devastation in his eyes made her chest ache. "Are you? Or is that simply what one says?" "I lost my father 6 months ago," Eleanor said quietly. "I know what it is to watch someone you love die and be powerless to stop it. I know what it is to wake each morning and forget, just for a moment, that they are gone, and then remembering feels like dying yourself." The Duke stared at her as though truly seeing her for the first time. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding. Then he nodded once and returned to his desk. "You may continue your work," he said, his voice once again cold and distant. But something had shifted. Eleanor felt it like a change in the air before a storm. She had glimpsed the man beneath the ice, and he had seen her as more than just a shadow in his library. The days fell into a pattern. Eleanor arrived at Ashford Hall each morning at 9. The Duke appeared at 10 with his coffee. They worked in silence, broken only by occasional questions from Eleanor about where certain books should be placed. The Duke's answers were curt but not unkind. Sometimes she felt his eyes on her as she worked, but when she turned, he was always looking at his papers. A week passed, then 2. Eleanor found herself looking forward to those quiet mornings in the library, despite the guilt that gnawed at her conscience. She was supposed to be seducing the Duke, but she had no idea how to accomplish such a task. She was not flirtatious by nature. She had no experience with men beyond polite conversation. Every night she returned home to Margaret and counted the days until the Duchess would demand results she could not provide. "You seem different," Margaret said one evening as they sat by the fire. Her sister looked better, the color returning to her cheeks, thanks to the medicine Eleanor could now afford. Happier, perhaps. "I am only glad you are recovering," Eleanor said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she found herself thinking about the Duke at odd moments. The way he frowned when he was deep in thought. The way he sometimes whispered to himself as he read. The way his hands moved across the pages of his books, gentle and reverent. She thought about the grief in his eyes and the loneliness that seemed to surround him like a cloak. She thought about how he had noticed she was hungry and fed her without making her feel ashamed. She thought about him far too much for a woman engaged in deception. On the 14th day, something changed. Eleanor was high on the ladder, replacing books on the uppermost shelf, when the Duke spoke. "Tell me about your father." She nearly dropped the book in her hands. "Your Grace, you said you lost him 6 months ago. Tell me about him." Eleanor descended the ladder slowly, her mind racing. He was a vicar, a good man who cared deeply for his parish. He loved books almost as much as he loved God. She smiled at the memory. "He used to read to my sister and me every evening. Shakespeare, Milton, even novels when my mother was not listening. He said stories teach us how to be human." The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "A wise man. He was. I miss him terribly." Eleanor's voice caught. "Some days I find myself wanting to tell him something, and then I remember it never becomes easier." "No," the Duke said quietly. "It does not. People tell you time heals all wounds, but that is a lie. Time only teaches you how to live with the wound. The pain never truly leaves." "You loved your wife very much." "I did. I do." He stood and walked to the window, as he often did when emotions threatened to surface. Catherine was light. She laughed easily. She found joy in everything. She made this house feel like a home. When she died, all the light went with her. Eleanor moved closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his words. "She would not want you to live in darkness forever." "How do you know what she would want?" His voice was sharp, but she heard the pain beneath the anger. "Because no one who loves someone wants them to suffer endlessly," Eleanor said softly. "I am certain she would want you to find happiness again, to live, not merely exist." The Duke turned to her, and the intensity in his grey eyes made her breath catch. "You speak of things you cannot understand." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, "but I understand loneliness. I understand what it is to feel invisible, to believe that you will never matter to anyone again." "You feel invisible?" He studied her face as though memorizing it. "How is that possible?" The question confused her. "I am a spinster of 28 with no fortune and no prospects, Your Grace. I am precisely the sort of woman society overlooks." "Then society is blind," he said, and the words sent warmth flooding through her chest. Before she could respond, the library door opened. The Duchess swept in, resplendent in a gown of crimson silk. Her eyes went immediately to Eleanor, narrowing with calculation. "Good afternoon, my dear husband," she said, her voice bright and false. "I see you have been keeping company with our new librarian. How cozy." The Duke's expression shuttered immediately, becoming cold and blank. "Miss Hartley is organizing the library. There is nothing cozy about it." "Of course not." The Duchess smiled, showing perfect white teeth. "I merely came to remind you that we are expected at Lady Pemberton's ball this evening. You have not forgotten? I have no desire to attend. Nevertheless, we will attend. It would be rude to refuse." The Duchess turned her sharp gaze on Eleanor. "You may leave early today, Miss Hartley. His Grace will not require your services this afternoon." Eleanor recognized a dismissal when she heard one. She curtsied and gathered her things quickly, aware of the tension crackling in the room. As she reached the door, she glanced back. The Duke was watching her with an expression she could not read. The Duchess was watching her husband with something that looked like suspicion and satisfaction combined. Eleanor fled, her heart pounding. She had the terrible feeling that she had just become a pawn in a much larger and more dangerous game than she had realized. That evening Eleanor sat in the cottage and tried not to imagine the Duke at Lady Pemberton's ball. She pictured him dancing with beautiful women in expensive gowns, women who knew how to flirt and charm, women who belonged in his world. The image made her chest ache with a feeling she refused to name. "You care for him," Margaret said, watching her sister with knowing eyes. "That is absurd," Eleanor protested. "He is a duke. I am nothing. You are not nothing. And the way you speak of him—" Margaret shook her head. "Be careful, Ellie. Men like that do not marry women like us. They may dally, but they do not commit." "He is not like that," Eleanor said fiercely, then caught herself. "I mean, I barely know him. It does not matter." But it did matter. It mattered far too much. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the library to find the Duke already there, which was unusual. He stood by the window, still wearing his evening clothes from the night before, his cravat loosened and his hair disheveled. He looked exhausted and utterly miserable. "Your Grace, are you well?" He turned, and she saw the darkness in his eyes. "I am never well, Miss Hartley. I thought you understood that." "Did something happen at the ball?" He laughed, a bitter sound. "My wife spent the entire evening parading eligible women before me. The widow of a baron, an earl's daughter, a viscount's sister, all of them perfect, beautiful, accomplished. She seems to think it is time for me to remarry." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "And do you wish to remarry?" "I wish to be left alone," he said harshly. "I wish for people to stop telling me how to live. I wish—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I do not know what I wish anymore." Eleanor set down her bag and moved closer. "You wish to stop hurting?" "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. "God, yes. I am so tired of this weight. This grief. It never ends. Catherine has been gone 3 years, and I still feel as though part of me died with her." "Then perhaps it is time to let yourself live again," Eleanor said gently. "Not to forget her, never to forget her, but to allow yourself moments of happiness without guilt." The Duke looked at her with such intensity that she felt stripped bare. "How did you become so wise?" "I am not wise. I am merely honest." He took a step closer, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with electricity. Eleanor could smell his cologne, something woodsy and masculine that made her head swim. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the tiny lines around his eyes that spoke of years of smiling before grief had stolen his joy. "You are different from other women I have known," he said, his voice low and rough. "You do not simper or flatter. You do not try to impress me with accomplishments. You simply are. Do you know how rare that is?" Eleanor's heart was beating so hard, she was certain he could hear it. "I have no accomplishments with which to impress you, Your Grace. I am only myself." "Only yourself," he repeated, and something like wonder crossed his face, as though that were not everything. His hand lifted, and for a breathless moment, Eleanor thought he might touch her face. But then sanity seemed to return. He stepped back abruptly, his expression closing off. "Forgive me," he said stiffly. "I have been up all night. I am not myself. You should continue your work." Eleanor wanted to tell him that he owed her no apology. She wanted to tell him that his almost touch had set every nerve in her body alight. She wanted to confess everything, the Duchess's scheme, her own deception, the way she had come to care for him despite every intention to remain detached. Instead, she curtsied and returned to the bookshelves, her hands trembling as she reached for another volume. The days that followed were torture of the sweetest kind. The Duke began to talk to her more, asking her opinions on books, discussing philosophy and poetry. He told her stories about Catherine, and Eleanor listened without jealousy, understanding that he needed to speak of the woman he had loved. In return, she told him about her father, her sister, the life she had once imagined for herself before poverty and circumstance had narrowed her world to simple survival. They began to exist in their own small universe within the library walls. The rest of Ashford Hall faded away. The servants who came and went were shadows. The world outside the windows was distant and unimportant. There was only the two of them, surrounded by thousands of stories, writing their own story in the margins of each day. One afternoon, as November wind howled outside and rain lashed the windows, Eleanor found a volume of sonnets that made her pause. She opened it, reading the familiar words, her lips moving silently. "What have you found?" the Duke asked from his desk. "Shakespeare's sonnets. My father's favorite. Read one to me." Eleanor looked up in surprise. "Your Grace? Please. I would like to hear your voice speak the words." Heat rushed to her cheeks, but she nodded. She chose Sonnet 1116, the one her father had read at her parents' wedding, the one about love that does not alter when it alteration finds. Her voice was soft but steady as she read, and when she finished, she looked up to find the Duke standing mere feet away, having crossed the room without her noticing. "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds," he quoted softly. "Do you believe that, Miss Hartley?" "I want to believe it," she whispered. "I want to believe there is love that endures despite all obstacles, love that does not fade or falter. I believed it once, before Catherine died, before I learned that death is the ultimate alteration. But your love for her has not altered," Eleanor pointed out. 3 years later, you still carry her in your heart. Is that not proof that such love exists?" The Duke's eyes locked with hers, and the moment stretched, taut and trembling with unspoken things. Eleanor felt dizzy, drowning in the grey depths of his gaze. She saw loneliness there, and pain, but also something new, something that looked like longing. "Eleanor?" he said, her name a question and a prayer on his lips. The library door crashed open. The Duchess stood in the doorway, her beautiful face a mask of fury barely concealed. 2 other women flanked her, society matrons whose presence meant judgment and gossip. "Ladies, allow me to introduce Miss Hartley, our librarian," the Duchess said sweetly, her eyes glittering with malice. Such a dedicated worker. She and my husband have been spending so much time together in here, organizing books, they say. Is that not charming? The implication was clear. The two matrons looked at Eleanor with expressions of scandalized delight. Here was fodder for gossip, a plain spinster and a wealthy duke, alone in a library day after day. How improper, how delicious. Eleanor felt shame burn through her. This was it. This was the trap. The Duchess had gathered witnesses to see Eleanor in a compromising position with the Duke. It did not matter that nothing improper had occurred. The mere appearance was enough to destroy whatever reputation Eleanor had left. Miss Hartley was just leaving, the Duke said coldly, his voice like ice. She has completed her work for the day. The dismissal stung more than any slap. Eleanor gathered her things with shaking hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. She curtsied and fled, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed until she was far from Ashford Hall. She stumbled down the long drive, the cold wind cutting through her cloak. She had been such a fool. She had allowed herself to forget this was all a game. She had allowed herself to care. Worse, she had allowed herself to care. Worse, she had allowed herself to hope. The Duchess had won. She had exposed Eleanor's presence in the Duke's life and ensured that any burgeoning affection would be crushed under the weight of scandal and shame. The Duke would never trust her now. He would believe she had been trying to trap him, just another fortune hunter angling for a title. Eleanor reached the cottage as darkness fell. Margaret took one look at her face and wrapped her in a tight embrace. What happened? I made a terrible mistake, Eleanor whispered. I forgot who I was. I forgot where I belonged. She told Margaret everything then. The Duchess's offer, the weeks in the library, the way she had come to care for the Duke, despite knowing it was impossible, the humiliation of that final scene. You must go back, Margaret said firmly. You must explain. There is nothing to explain. I accepted money to seduce a man. That is the truth. How can I defend myself against truth? But you did not seduce him. You cared for him. That is different. Is it? Eleanor asked bitterly. In the end, I still deceived him. I still entered his life under false pretenses. He will never forgive that. That night, Eleanor lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the Duke's grey eyes and the way they had softened when he looked at her. She thought about his voice reading poetry, his rare smiles, his unexpected kindness. She thought about the person he had begun to become again in her presence, still wounded, still grieving, but no longer entirely lost in darkness. And she thought about how she had ruined everything. The next morning, a footman arrived at the cottage with a letter. Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The words were brief and devastating. Miss Hartley, your services are no longer required at Ashford Hall. Your final wages are enclosed. Do not return. Ashford. No explanation. No chance to defend herself. Simply dismissal, cold and final. Elena stared at the letter until the words blurred. Then she carefully folded it and tucked it away, feeling as though her heart had folded and tucked itself away with it. 2 days passed. Eleanor moved through them like a ghost. She told herself it was better this way. She had saved Margaret. She had the money the Duchess had promised for her efforts, delivered by a servant with no message attached. It was enough to see them through the winter. She should be grateful. But gratitude was impossible when every breath felt like grief. On the 3rd day, Margaret shook her awake before dawn. Ellie, wake up. Someone is at the door. Eleanor rose, confused and still half asleep. She pulled on a wrapper and descended the stairs. Through the window, she saw a carriage outside, fine and black with the Ashford crest on the door. Her heart began to pound. She opened the door to find the Duke standing on her doorstep. He was dressed in riding clothes, his hair wind-swept, his face showing signs of sleepless nights. He looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. Eleanor stepped aside wordlessly. He entered the small cottage, seeming too large for the modest space. His presence filled every corner. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, took one look at the scene, and tactfully retreated. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, but he held up a hand. "Let me speak first. I have spent 3 days in hell, Eleanor. 3 days, believing that everything I thought I knew was a lie. My wife came to me after that scene in the library. She told me everything. How she hired you to seduce me. How she wanted to test my fidelity. How you were nothing more than a paid actress in her little drama." His eyes burned into hers. "Is it true?" Eleanor wanted to lie. She wanted to protect herself. But she had deceived him enough. "Yes," she whispered. "She offered me £200. My sister was ill. We had no money. I agreed to try to catch your attention." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "But I did not know she meant to humiliate me. I did not know it was a trap. And I swear to you, I could not. What? I could not go through with it," Eleanor said brokenly. "I could not seduce you because every day I spent with you made me care more. I stopped seeing you as a duke or a means to save my sister. I started seeing you as a man who was hurting, a man who needed someone to simply sit with him in his grief, a man who was kind beneath all his pain." She wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I know I should have told you the truth immediately, but I was a coward, and then it was too late because I had fallen." She stopped herself, but the words hung in the air between them, almost spoken. "Because you had fallen in love with me," the Duke finished softly. Eleanor looked away, unable to bear the expression on his face. "Yes, though I know such a feeling is presumptuous and foolish and entirely inappropriate. You loved your wife. You could never care for someone like me. I am nobody. Nothing. A woman who sold herself for money, even if the task was impossible from the start." Silence stretched between them. Eleanor waited for him to leave, waited for the final dismissal that would end this chapter of her life forever. Instead, she felt his hand beneath her chin, gently tilting her face up. His grey eyes were bright with emotion she had never seen there before. "You are not nothing," he said fiercely. "You are the woman who brought light back into my darkness. The woman who listened without judgment when I spoke of Catherine. The woman who was herself completely and honestly in every moment we shared." His thumb brushed away her tears with infinite tenderness. "Yes, you accepted my wife's scheme. Yes, you deceived me initially. But Eleanor, you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. You gave me hope. You gave me a reason to look forward to each morning. You gave me yourself. But I lied to you. And I forgive you, because I understand desperation. I understand doing whatever is necessary to save those we love. And because..." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Because I have fallen in love with you too, Eleanor Hartley, completely, irrevocably, in a way I never thought possible again." Eleanor's heart stopped, then started again, racing wildly. "You cannot mean that. I have never meant anything more in my life. These 3 days without you have been torture. The library feels empty. The entire house feels empty. My life feels empty. You have become essential to my existence, and I cannot bear to lose you. Your wife will never allow it. Society will never accept it. I am too far beneath you." "Society be damned," the Duke said with sudden vehemence. "My wife has no say in my choices. She thought to prove me weak and easily tempted. Instead, she proved that my heart was still capable of love. She gave me the greatest gift, though she never intended it. She brought you into my life. He took Eleanor's hands in his, and the warmth of his touch made her tremble. I do not care about your birth, or your fortune, or any of the things society deems important. I care about you, your kindness, your honesty, the way you see me not as a title but as a man. Eleanor, will you marry me? The question was so unexpected, so impossible, that Eleanor could only stare at him. You wish to marry me? More than I have wished for anything in 3 years. Say yes, please. Make me the happiest man in England. Allow me to spend the rest of my life ensuring you never doubt your worth again. Eleanor thought about all the reasons she should refuse. The scandal, the gossip, the Duchess's fury, the Tongue's judgment. She thought about how different their worlds were, how impossible this match would seem to everyone who knew them. Then she thought about the Duke's eyes when he looked at her, the way he had fed her when she was hungry, the conversations that had made her feel seen for the first time in her life, the love that had grown between them in the quiet sanctuary of the library among thousands of stories until they had become their own story worth telling. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. The Duke's face transformed. Joy, pure and bright, chased away the shadows that had lingered there so long. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were precious beyond measure. Eleanor buried her face against his chest and felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. I will make you happy, he promised. I swear it. You already have, Eleanor said, looking up at him, simply by seeing me, by choosing me, by loving me when the world said I was unworthy of love. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her then, soft and reverent, as though she was something sacred. Eleanor had never been kissed before. She had imagined it might be awkward or strange. Instead, it felt like coming home. It felt like every empty place inside her was suddenly filled with light. When they finally parted, both breathless, the Duke rested his forehead against hers. We will face opposition. My wife will be furious. Society will gossip. Are you prepared for that? I am prepared for anything, as long as we face it together. Then let them talk, let them rage. You are mine now, Eleanor, and I am yours. Nothing and no one will separate us. The next weeks were indeed difficult. The Duchess, when informed of the engagement, flew into a rage that echoed through Ashford Hall. She had expected to expose a gold digger and embarrass her husband. Instead, she had inadvertently orchestrated his happiness. Her fury knew no bounds. She threatened scandal. She threatened to contest the marriage. She threatened everything she could think of. The Duke listened to all her threats with perfect calm, then quietly informed her that she was welcome to leave Ashford Hall and take up residence at the Dower House. He would provide for her generously, but she was no longer welcome in his home or his life. You never loved me, the Duchess spat. Catherine was the one you wanted. I was always second. Then you should be glad to be free of me, the Duke replied evenly. Go and find someone who can love you as you wish to be loved. I cannot be that man. I never could be. The Duchess left, taking her bitterness and her beauty with her. The house seemed to breathe easier in her absence. Society was indeed scandalized by the match. A duke marrying a penniless spinster, outrageous, improper, clear evidence that grief had addled his mind. The gossip columns had a field day. Invitations dried up. Matrons whispered behind fans. Neither Eleanor nor the Duke cared. They were married in a quiet ceremony attended only by Margaret, who wept with joy, and a handful of the Duke's oldest friends, who looked at Eleanor and saw her for what she was, a woman who had saved their friend from a lifetime of darkness. The wedding night was tender and sweet. The Duke, ever gentle, introduced Eleanor to the mysteries of marriage with patience and love. He kissed every inch of her skin and whispered that she was beautiful until she almost believed it. Eleanor discovered that intimacy was not something to fear, but something to celebrate, a physical expression of the emotional bond they had forged. Afterward, lying in the Duke's arms beneath soft sheets, Eleanor felt more content than she had ever dreamed possible. "Do you miss your old life?" the Duke asked, his fingers trailing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "My old life was cold and full of fear," Eleanor said honestly. "This life is warm and full of love. There is no comparison. No regrets, only that I let myself be hired in the first place. I wish our beginning had been honest." "Our beginning was unconventional," the Duke acknowledged, "but perhaps it had to be. I was so lost in grief that I would never have noticed you otherwise. The universe had to conspire to put you directly in my path." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I am grateful for the conspiracy." Eleanor laughed, the sound light and free. "When you say it that way, it sounds almost romantic." "It is romantic. The most romantic story I know. You were hired to tempt me and ended up saving me instead." "How can that be anything but fate?" "Fate," Eleanor repeated, tasting the word. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps some things are simply meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem." "I know one thing is meant to be," the Duke said, turning her in his arms so he could look into her eyes. "Us, you and me, for the rest of our lives." "For the rest of our lives," Eleanor echoed, and sealed the promise with a kiss. The years that followed were not without challenges. Some in society never accepted Eleanor as the Duchess of Ashford. There were always whispers, always those who remembered her origins and looked down their noses at her. But Eleanor had the Duke's love, and that made everything else bearable. She transformed Ashford Hall, filling it with warmth and life. She opened the library to the children of the village, teaching them to read. She supported Margaret, who made a full recovery and eventually married a kind young doctor. She gave the Duke 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who filled the halls with laughter. Most importantly, she loved the Duke with all her heart, and he loved her in return. They walked the gardens together each evening, talking of everything and nothing. They read to each other by the fire on cold nights. They shared their fears and dreams, and found that together they could face anything. The Duke never forgot Catherine. Her portrait still hung in his study, but the grief no longer consumed him. He had learned that the heart is vast enough to hold both remembrance and new love. He could honor his first wife's memory while building a life with his second wife, the woman who had seen him at his darkest and chosen to bring light. On their 10th anniversary, the Duke took Eleanor back to the library where they had first truly seen each other. It had been remodeled over the years, expanded and filled with even more books, but the essence remained the same. A sanctuary of stories, a place where 2 lost souls had found each other. "Do you remember when you read me Sonnet 11:16? the Duke asked, pulling Eleanor close. "How could I forget? It was the day before everything fell apart." "It was the day before everything came together," he corrected. "That was the moment I knew I loved you, though I would not admit it even to myself. And now I admit it every day. I love you, Eleanor. You are my light, my joy, my everything." Eleanor looked around the library, at the thousands of books that held thousands of stories. Stories of adventure and tragedy, comedy and romance, stories of people finding their way through impossible circumstances to arrive at happiness. "We became a story worth telling," she said softly. "The best story," the Duke agreed, "the one where love conquers all, where two people from different worlds find their way to each other, where endings become beginnings, and where a woman hired to seduce a duke ended up winning his heart instead. "You did more than win my heart," the duke said, kissing her tenderly. "You healed it, you filled it, you made it whole again." Eleanor smiled against his lips. "Then we are even, because you did the same for me." Outside the library windows, the sun set over the gardens of Ashford Hall, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Inside, surrounded by books and love, the Duke and Duchess held each other close. Their story had begun with deception and desperation, with grief and manipulation, but it had transformed into something beautiful. It had become a love story for the ages. Proof that even the most unlikely beginnings could lead to the happiest of endings. Proof that love, real love, was worth every risk and every challenge. Proof that sometimes the heart knows the way even when the mind cannot see the path. And in the quiet sanctuary of the library, among thousands of stories, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford lived out their own tale, one of redemption, healing, and love that would endure long after the final page was turned.